Welcome to this virtual class. Nasa week 16 na tayo. Yung topic, Concept of Disaster Risk Reduction and Management, or concept of DRRM. Now, may 3 parts ito, but then one part lang ang ating i-discuss. Dapat i-discuss ito for 3 consecutive weeks. So, na-discuss na natin yung mga disaster risk, exposure, vulnerability. Ito yung sa part 1, no? First, early weeks ng subject. Hazard and various types of geological and geological hazards. Types and the hazards. So now, how do we deal with those hazards and prevent those hazards to become disaster? So, nabigay na natin kung anong klase yung mga natural disasters, no? Paano ma-lessen yung effect, no? Especially yung mga hindi kaaya-aya ng mga pangyayari, no? Brought about those hazards. So this part, this week, no, sa module na ito, ang i-discuss ang DRRM. So again, may 3 parts. So isang part lang ang ating i-tackle. Okay. So, ang i-tackle natin yung key concepts, yung principles and elements of reducing disaster risk and how important this is in our life. Okay. So, our objectives is to discuss the key concepts and principles and elements of the RRM. Recognize the importance of the RR on one's life. And discuss different community-based practices for managing disaster risk to specific hazards, develop a community preparedness plan, prepare survival kits and materials for one's family, and for public information and advocacy. So, again, yung first 2 lang ang ating madiscuss. Ito naman para sa susunod na mga weeks. Okay. So what is disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management? DRR, and DRM. Okay. So disaster risk refers to the potential disaster losses of lives, health status, livelihoods, assets, and services which could occur to a particular community or a society over some specified future or time period. And when we say disaster, this is outcome of continuing presence of disaster risk. Disaster risk, no? So the concept of lessening the potential disaster losses is what is called disaster risk reduction. By the word reduction, ipa-reduce yung risk of disaster. Okay, so according to my definition ito, no? According to International Strategy for Disaster Reduction or ISDR, disaster risk reduction or DRR is the concept and practice of reducing disaster risk through systematic efforts to analyze and manage the causal factors of disasters through reduced exposure to hazards, lessen the vulnerability of people and property, wise management of land and the environment, improve preparedness for adverse events. Now, it aims to reduce socioeconomic vulnerabilities to disasters as well as deal with environmental and other hazards that trigger them. So the scope is comprehensive and extensive. that every development and humanitarian work can incorporate DRR activities. Pag sabihin natin vulnerabilities, this refers to inability of people, yung kahinaan ng tao, no? Organization and societies to withstand adverse impacts from, shall we say, disaster, no? Ka-focus tayo sa disaster risk. Okay. So, yan ang definition ng DRR according to ISDR. Again, to reduce, no? So, DRRM is the systematic process of using administrative directives, organization, and operational skills and capacities to implement strategies, policies, and improve coping capacities in order to lessen the adverse impacts of hazards and possibility of disaster. Of course, the aim is to avoid, to lessen, or transfer the adverse effects of hazards through activities and measures. Okay, so yung mga floodings, earthquakes, volcanoes do not kill or harm people, but unsafe location and structures do. Unsafe location. So kung ikaw ay nakatira doon na mga earthquake, say flood-prone areas, no, sa tabi ng volcanoes, no, unsafe yung location ninyo. As well as kung ano yung structure ninyo, no? For example, yung mga bahay na sa tabi ng river, no? Okay. So, yung flooding hindi maka-harm ng tao, pero yung unsafe structure can kill people. Okay, maka-harm sa tao. So, these hazards turn into catastrophic events because of defective building designs and construction in unsafe places and in an appropriate location. So public and private investments require to be risk sensitive so that every single aspect from design, budget, allocation and use material, specification, and construction are monitored and properly accounted for. So that is why kung sa mga new buildings, no, kailangan maraming mga approval, maraming table na dadaanan before ma-approve yung request, no? So para ma-monitor properly. Okay. So reducing disaster risk is a concern of everybody, from local to global and global to local. From 2005 to 2015, the UN, or United Nations, through the International Non-Binding Agreement called Hyogo Framework of Action, or HFA, has guided the nations in disaster risk reduction. In 2015, the international community at the UN conference in Japan, convened by the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, or UNISDR, formulated the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, or SFDRR, which charts the global course over the next 15 years. That was 2015. So during the consultations and negotiations that led to its finalization, strong calls were made to develop practical guidance to support implementation, ensure engagement ownership of action by all stakeholders, and strengthen accountability in disaster risk reduction. The SFDRR, which has 7 global targets, seeks through to 2030 to prevent the creation of new disaster risk and to curb existing risk around the world. So may 7 global targets ang SFDRR. Ano yun? Okay. First, substantially reduce global disaster mortality by 2030. Reduce. Kung hindi man ma-zero, at least bababa. No? So aiming to lower average per 100,000 global mortality rate in the decade 2020-2030 compared to the period 2005 and 2015. Second, substantially reduce the number of affected people globally. Okay, so globally by 2030. So aiming to lower average global figure per 100,000 in the decade 2020-2030 compared to the period 2005-2015. So third, reduce direct disaster economic loss. So economic loss refers to financial loss or damage suffered by a person in relation to global gross domestic product by 2030. Fourth, substantially reduce disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services, among them health and educational facilities, including through developing their resilience by 2030. So say resilience, this para katatagan. So develop resilience, no, by 2030. Infrastructure. Okay. 5, substantially increase the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020. So increase the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020. Okay, 6, substantially enhance international cooperation to developing countries through adequate and sustainable support to complement their national action for implementation of this framework by 2030. Enhance international cooperation sa mga developing countries. And substantially increase the availability of and access of multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information and assessment to the people by 2030. Okay. Increase the availability of access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information and assessments to the people by 2030. So, expect na maraming mga warning systems, no? Devices, mga information, no? Paraan na ma-inform yung mga tao. And my 4 priorities for action. First, understand the disaster risk reduction or understand disaster risk. Understand disaster risks. So sa mga local government units, may mga free seminars para pareho nito sa inyo, isang subject, but then may mga seminars about this. No? So disaster risk management should be based on an understanding of disaster risk in all its dimensions of vulnerability, capacity, exposure of persons and assets, hazards, characteristics, and the environment. So such knowledge can be used for risk assessment, prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and response. Kasi pag alam ninyo ano yung disaster risk management, ma-manage na yung other factors, no? Like how to prevent, how to mitigate, kailan dapat prepared, no? At saka ready ba sa mga responses. Priority 2, strengthen disaster risk governance to manage disaster risks. So disaster risk governance at the national, regional, and global levels. It's very important for prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, rehabilitation. And it fosters collaboration and partnership. So actually, sa national level, no, pinapasa yan nila doon sa mga cities, sa mga municipalities, no, and then papunta sa mga barangay. Then kung may problema, from the barangay pataas na naman yan, no? Priority 3, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. Okay, so public and private investment in disaster risk prevention and reduction through structural and non-structural measures are essential to enhance the economic, social, health, and cultural resilience of persons, communities, countries, and their assets, as well as the environment. So take note na included always yung environment. Okay, fourth, enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response to build back better. So in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. So enhance disaster preparedness for effective response, no? In recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. So the growth of disaster risk means there is a need to strengthen disaster preparedness for response. Take action in anticipation of events and ensure capacities are in place for effective response and recovery of all levels. The recovery, rehabilitation, and construction phase is a critical opportunity to build back better. So including through integrating disaster risk reduction into the development measures. That's the fourth priorities for action. So the concept of DRR includes, DRR is everybody's responsibility. Everybody's responsibility. So responsibility mo sa iyong mga family members, lahat tayo. No? Does not belong to government portfolio alone. Hindi lang ito sa government. So let's not wait na yung government ang hintayin natin na magtrabaho, no? So it's our responsibility. Halimbawa lang, kung meron tayong basura, no, masura, huwag natin hintayin yung gobyerno. Tayo na mismo ang ano yung proseso doon? I-segregate, tapos proper disposal. Huwag nating hintayin yung mga government paid individual na sila pa yung pagliligpit ng mga basura. Pareho din yan, no? It's our responsibility. So each one of us is responsible to reduce risk, no? Disaster risk. Kasi pag pahayaan natin yung, for example, yung basura, magdudulot yun ng flooding, especially pag mag-clog na yung mga drainage, no? So in our daily life, Alam din natin kung sa mga natural hazards, anong gagawin before, during, and post-disasters. So, yun ang mga na-discuss sa mga previous na mga weeks. No? Ano ang gagawin before, during, and after. As DRR is our responsibility, therefore, it is our choice. Kung magkalat ka, so that's your choice. So either to reduce exposure to hazards, reduce our vulnerabilities, increase our knowledge and skills, develop proper and correct attitude towards life, or the other way around, to increase our susceptibility to become vulnerable to hazards. It's our choice, no? But then, kawawa din tayo, no? Pipili tayo ng hindi dapat. Okay, as we have chosen the correct path of contributing towards the RR, then we decide and plan how to put into practice our choice. So of course, siguro walang pipili na ng negative, no? Negative choice. It's always a positive choice. But then, it is not easy to choose the right one. Kailangan niya ng trabaho, no? So, we need to decide to plan how to put it into practice. For example, do not throw your garbage everywhere. To grow our own food without using chemicals. This is organic farming. To lessen or avoid eating meat. Bakit kaya ipalesen yung eating meat? Kasi yung dumi ng mga hayop would produce methane gas, no? That would harm our environment. To reuse and recycle. Reuse and recycle sa mga garbages, no? So, kung pwedeng magamit pa, ma-recycle, yun ang gagawin. To vote intelligently. So, dapat alam natin kung sino dapat ang ating ipo-vote, no? And among others, no? Each choice, decision, and action each one of us take determines whether we will be victims or survivors. More vulnerable to or more resilient. Ano yung vulnerable? No? At ano yung resilient? We say vulnerable, kahinaan, no? Or we say resilient, katatagan, no? Against hazards. Okay. So, again, yung choice natin, yung decision, yung action, determines whether we will be victims. So, kung alam natin na hazardous yung area na yon and kailangan na mag-vacate, then alis doon para hindi maging victim. At saka, yung mga na-discuss na mga topics, yung before, ano ang gagawin kung may mga hazards, no? Huwag ninyo yung kalimutan. What are the elements of disaster risk reduction? So, addressing root causes of vulnerabilities, a developing agenda. So, this means that various disaster risk reduction, yung mga programs, project, and activities need to be mainstream in development agenda of the country. Disaster risk assessment that include examining, analyzing at the hazard, exposure, vulnerabilities, and capacities of the local communities and governance structures from local to national. And this is an important element to be able to design appropriate disaster risk measures. So again, disaster risk assessment include examining and analyzing the hazard, exposure, vulnerabilities, and capacities of the local communities. Next, we have preventive actions that include environmental protection and preservation. For example, control of mining activities that are detrimental to the whole life cycle. So preventive action, no, and preservation. So by the control of mining activities, ma-preserve yung mga minerals doon. Protected. Kasi pag say mining, maraming masira doon. Mitigation measures that includes structural. Say structures sa mga building design and construction. And non-structural measures, legislation, policies, laws, capacity, and development. But then, marami tayong laws. Ang problem lang dito, yung pag-implement and monitoring. So, preparedness measures that include activities taken regularly such as forecasting, prediction, planning, training drills, simulation, exercises, warehousing, stockpiling, etc. So that people, communities, and agencies are ready to meet the onslaught of any calamity. The term preparedness measure. So, on your part, marami din kayong magawa. No? So, included in preparedness is the design and setting up of an end-to-end early warning system. So, sa mga authorized person itong trabaho na to. And then to provide timely and effective information to the population that are potentially to be hit by a hazard. Siguro ang magawa sa inyong and no, sa inyong part, pwede kayo makapag-volunteer, no? Sa mga actually may mga local personnel tayo na naka-assign sa mga DRRM na nasa barangay level na. And then emergency response to affected areas and population by a hazard event to avoid further deterioration of their conditions. Emergency response. This includes the assistance of evacuate people and manage the evacuation centers, provision of food, water, and supplies. Say emergency response, included dyan yung assistance sa mga tao na nag-evacuate. Of course, to manage food, water, and supplies, and to attend their needs. Okay, next, damage and needs and capacities assessment to determine what requirements that are still needed during and post emergencies, particularly how to assist people in saving or recovering their livelihood. And recovery measures that include the assessment of what are needed to rehabilitate and reconstruct the affected areas. So after after na ito nangyari, no? So ano ang kailangan i-rehabilitate, reconstruct, especially sa mga affected areas, no? Most especially pag merong mga damage done by earthquakes, yung mga floods, no? Yun ang maraming mga maapektuhan. Disaster risk reduction is an element of a sustainable development process. It has been established and recognized that development goals cannot be achieved without addressing the disaster risk of any developing nations. And disaster risk reduction must therefore be integrated in the development planning of the country. Okay, sa mga officers, no? Sa gobyerno. Dapat included ito, no? Integrated yung development planning sa Philippines. Okay, so recognition that the disaster can be indeed jeopardize development. So efforts on the one hand, but disasters can also be taken advantage as an opportunity to introduce development programs and activities on the other hand. And realization that true development can arrest current risk and reduce future risk, but flawed development can in fact increase disaster risk. Okay, so again, true development can arrest current risk and reduce future risk, but weak, false development can in fact increase disaster risk. So what are the principles governing disaster risk reduction? Okay, communities or local people need to be recognized and capacitated. So kailangan din sila i-recognize, especially yung mga volunteers, no? Kailangan i-recognize and capacitated because they are the frontliners or they are the first line of defense. So before any government agencies and non-government organization come to support or rescue, the local people have already done initial efforts to help themselves and to protect them. Okay. Promulgation of legislation, crafting of policies, enactment of laws, and implementing guidelines are necessary and important, but without proper enforcement and implementation, safety and protection of citizens are not ensured. Okay. So DRR is part of our daily lives. That is why kinakailangan na kung ano man ang nalalaman niyo, ano man yung nakuha niyo sa subject, basically, kung hindi man lahat, no, meron kayong natutunan, I believe, no? Ay, huwag ninyo itago yan. Gamitin ninyo yan in your daily lives. No? So, siguro may mga mas may nalalaman pa kayo sa ibang tao, no? So, you need to share that knowledge and say your action, no? Wag naman yung alam mo yung effect. For example, alam mo yung effect sa pagtapon ng basura kahit saan. And then, yun pa yung gagawin mo. Tapos alam ng kapitbahay na meron kang DRRR na subject. Diba? Uy, merong DRRR na subject. Saan pala yung natutunan ito? No? Must be in it needs to be in our consciousness that whatever we do, we should remember that we as individuals can either promote or hinder DRR through our actions. So lahat na nalalaman ninyo, you put that in action. So by doing that, di kayong matawag na knowledgeable individual. So DRR is not the one-off activity. It is a cross-cutting element that requires to be part of our society. So disaster risk reduction is a must, as this is the way forward, especially at this stage when climate change impacts are a reality to all. So many more people are being killed and affected, more infrastructures are damaged, more livelihood are destroyed, and investments are becoming more insecure. Resources for development are being diverted to fund that needed emergency response and recovery efforts, resulting to delayed achievements of development goals. Thus, addressing disaster risk becomes a very important priority. So, despite this reality, the RR initiatives are still lacking. So, in some sector and areas, so there is a need to prioritize disaster risk reduction, especially sa mga disaster-prone areas. No? So, developed countries need to rethink their paradigm to reduce their consumption pattern, to reduce the greenhouse gases emission, to reduce the production of war machines, to stop initiating wars, no, to think of ways how to lessen and disaster risk in their development world and developing at the least developed countries. So inequality continues. The World Risk Index records world disaster risks are concentrated disproportionately in poorer countries. Kawawa, no? So specifically with those that are weakly governed. That is why it is very important to choose your what is this? To vote wisely, no? Dapat strong yung mag-govern sa country. More importantly, poor people or poor countries need to reconsider their priorities in their agenda, program, and action. So it is very important na alamin natin, especially kayo, I believe na pwede na kayo makapili sa mga government officials, no? Through voting. Next, we have, why is disaster risk reduction important in our lives? Disaster risk reduction is crucial in sustainable development. As previously mentioned, disasters derail development efforts. What is derail development efforts? Obstruct the progress of countries need to invest more in prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. As in health, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. So, ibig sabihin na mas maganda yung mag-prevent tayo, no? Para hindi tayo masakit than magpapadoktor tayo at magpapamedicate, no? So, this similar that to disaster. Prevention is better than cure. So, as long as kung pwede lang ma-prevent, ma-lessen yung effect, ma-reduce yung mga effects sa tao, sa properties, sa environment, no? Yun ang gagawin. So prevention and preparedness are keys to address the issues of disaster. Prevention, how to prevent disasters, and ano yung mga paano i-prepare ang mga tao na kung pwede wala talagang ma-damage, wala talagang mamamatay kung merong mga ganoon na mga hazards, disaster. Okay. So the DRR is extremely important for individuals, for ordinary people like you and me. So our future is at stake with the current human source hazards and natural hazards events so fast passing through. So alam natin na merong man-made hazard at saka natural hazards. So ang una-una nating ma-control yung mga man-made hazards, no? Nasa mga kamay natin yan, tao ang source, no? But then yung mga natural hazards, kahit hindi natin yan ma-control, then we need to prepare. Kaya that's why kailangan ng mga training, ano ang gagawin before, on, at saka after, para ma-lessen yung effect, no? Negative impact due to that hazards. So we need to protect ourselves, our families, and our communities. Kaya many times I told you na kung ano man yung nalalaman ninyo, gamitin niyo yan sa daily life ninyo. Huwag niyo yung kalimutan kung ano yung mga tips na naibigay doon sa mga lessons natin. That is to protect yourselves, families, and even makatulong kayo sa communities. So no one will be safe anymore if we do not think of contributing towards the goals of disaster risk reduction. DRR is a proactive measure which everyone needs to be or to embrace. Okay? So ito yung part 1 ng 3 about DRRM. So that's all for today.